It's a tense October morning in the year of 732, and Charles Martel, leader of the Franks, shouts a few words of encouragement to his men upon sighting the enemy. Closing in fast was an Umayyad wave of steel and swords, set to crash against the dogged shield wall of their Frankish foes. The battle for the fate of Tours, and perhaps Christian Europe itself, was about to begin. By the year 732, the dynamic Islamic faith had spread far from its Arabian heartland. Already by the mid-7th century, the new Umayyad Caliphate controlled an empire stretching from Khorasan in the east to Tripoli in the west. In 711, an alliance of North African Arab and Berber adventurers invaded the Visigothic kingdom, defeating King Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete and initiating the complete subjugation of Hispania within a few years. With Roderick slain, Attila had assumed the crown only to be driven into Septimania, which was in turn conquered by 719. The Caliphate's subjugation of Septimania now extended Umayyad control into the underbelly of the Frankish world and made Odo of Aquitaine especially anxious. Throughout 720, the Muslim governor of Al-Andalus, Al-Sam, consolidated his hold there, beginning the arduous siege of Visigothic holdout Carcassonne. The next year, Al-Sam launched a serious attempt at conquering Toulouse, but was defeated in a daring night attack outside the city, Prince Odo's desperate charge temporarily checking the Muslim advance. During this disaster, command of the Muslim remnants was taken by a certain Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi. As his name suggests, al-Rahman was of the Ghafiqi clan, one of the elite Arab clans who had settled Al-Andalus some years before. Renowned as a man of generosity, piety and courage, Al-Rahman's prestige was also enhanced through his friendship with one of the sons of Umar himself, who was the second of the so-called rightly guided caliphs that immediately succeeded the Prophet Muhammad. Though proving himself very capable of commanding in a crisis, Al-Rahman was replaced as governor by the senior North African governor, who saw him as too generous to the defeated men. Al-Rahman's time would come, however. Between his brief and longer services as Wali of Al-Andalus, he instead ruled Septimania from Narbonne, close to the site of the battlefield of Toulouse. It's now that we turn our attention north to the Frankish world. Odo's triumph outside of Toulouse in 721 was certainly no unified Christian front against the Muslim invaders. Odo had petitioned the support of the de facto Frankish ruler Charles Martel, but had ultimately been refused and had to face the southern threat alone. Charles's refusal was symptomatic of the fragmented nature of the Frankish domain. Having united the Frankish mayoralties, the death of Charles's father, Pepin of Herstal, resulted in a civil war from which Charles ultimately emerged victorious. However, it was during this upheaval that in 714, Duke Odo of Aquitaine, nominally a Frankish vassal, declared himself prince of his own domain. Effectively independent from around 670 anyway, Aquitaine's borders had even expanded northwards during the Frankish decline. Yet though Odo rivaled Charles as a power of the region, his ambitions were checked in 719, and an accord was reached whereby Charles recognized Odo's status in Aquitaine in exchange for custody of his ally, King Chilperic II. Whom Charles used to legitimize his own rule as sole mayor, later reinforcing his own grip on power through the do-nothing King Thierry IV. Meanwhile, in Al-Andalus, tensions between Berber and Arab Muslims would spill over into bloodshed and provided the basis for the Al-Rahman's incursion into Aquitaine the following year. Far from a harmonious polity, the Muslims of Al-Andalus were arguably as fractured as their northern foes. Tensions between the minority Arab elite and Berbers, both of whom constituted the Muslim ruling class, had simmered beneath the surface, and after hearing of the oppression of his fellow Berbers in North Africa, the regional governor Munusa threw off Umayyad control. Munusa thought it prudent to form a pact of friendship with the equally embattled Odo on his border. This alliance was sealed through the marriage of the Berber, to Odo's illegitimate but beautiful daughter. For Al-Rahman, Munusa's pact with an enemy bordering his lands could not go unanswered. He also likely felt he had unfinished business with Munusa's new ally too, and it seems that Al-Rahman began planning his push into Aquitaine from the time of his second accession as governor. From 730 to 732, Al-Rahman toured his province, engaging in the usual duties of his office while he had also commanded his army to coalesce at Pamplona. All in all, Al-Rahman's force may have numbered from 15 to 20,000 men, though this is one of the more hotly debated areas of this campaign. Back north, far from concerned at the build-up of Umayyad power across the Pyrenees, Charles Martel was more worried about a meeting between the ex-mayor of Neustria and Odo, which he feared may lead up to an alliance against him. Meanwhile, in the same year, Muslim raiders penetrated as far as Burgundy, nominally under Charles's control, and even seized and burnt down the rich city of Autun. Charles evidently took the threat of Odo far more seriously that year, as he twice attacked northeastern Aquitaine in warning. Traversing the Loire, the Carolingian army captured and looted Bourges, though Odo swiftly retook it. In the south, probably during summer or early autumn of 731, Al-Rahman moved to crush Munusa. Moving into the rebel governor's province, he defeated his army, took his main stronghold, and then cornered Munusa himself in the mountains, Odo's ally, throwing himself from a cliff to avoid capture. In either May or early June of 732, the Muslim army finally moved into Aquitaine, moving not through the usual eastern route, but via the west. This brought Al-Rahman's army squarely into the heartland of Odo's power, and also avoided the Toulouse region where his predecessor had met such a sticky end. Al-Rahman's main body headed determinedly north towards Bordeaux, while smaller parties fanned off to devastate the lands between the Pyrenees and Garonne, meeting scant resistance. In answer, Odo assembled his own force of Gascons and Basque militia, fixing themselves along the river Garonne. Perhaps recalling his great victory 11 years before, Odo remained outside of his capital, preferring instead to meet his foes in the field. However, unlike at Toulouse, he was defeated. Seizing Bordeaux itself, the Muslim host showed little mercy, burning any church they found and slaying many inhabitants. Such a prize also substantially increased their collective hoard of loot. Al-Rahman now moved to finish Odo himself, meeting the Aquitani force once more and wiping out most of his army. With little option, Odo fled north with his remaining followers to seek the aid of another enemy. Encountering Charles at Rheims, the Frankish ruler responded by mustering his own army from all three of his realms. Marching to Orléans, Charles crossed the river Loire via Ambrose and, to his relief, found the city of Tours, within his own territory, untouched. With the defeat of Odo, Al-Rahman's army split off and raided the wider region for around 3 months before reassembling at the gutted Saintes and heading ominously for the rich city of Poitiers. Poitiers itself was surrounded by walls, however. The place had large, unfortified suburbs that left it vulnerable, the Umayyads sacking and looting the abbey church of Saint-Hilaire. Already heavily laden with loot, Al-Rahman's army bypassed the fortified city itself and made north for the more vulnerable and even richer abbey church of St. Martin outside the city of Tours. Yet if the Muslim warriors looked greedily forward to this substantial increase in their riches, then they were to be sorely disappointed. Having been halted close to crossing the Vienne by the advancing Franks, the Muslim army pulled back to a defensive position, establishing their camp between the rivers on or around the 18th of October. It's generally agreed that a period of standoff ensued. Indeed, it's likely that Charles's army was encamped on the opposite bank of the Vienne for some days and eventually crossed to make their own camp north of a modern-day hamlet. Sporadic skirmishing took place in the build-up to the main day of battle. The Frankish force fielded that day consisted of many grizzled veterans of Charles's earlier campaigns, as well as less experienced militia units. Almost exclusively an infantry force, the army did, however, have a small cavalry arm led by Odo himself. In contrast, the Umayyad army was largely mounted, more mobile and better equipped. As per the usual Umayyad practice, their camp would have been in a relatively secure location, most likely on some high ground a little off and surrounded by woods. Though, as events will show, it was not so secure as to be invulnerable to attack. The Umayyad army was also likely formed in the traditional 5 divisions of a centre, 2 wings, as well as a vanguard and rearguard. Given it is highly unlikely the Umayyad camp was left undefended, the Muslim rearguard was likely either close to or at the camp itself. Early on the morning of October 25th, the Umayyad army once again arrayed for battle, and this time attacked the solid Frankish ranks. Charles must have been aware that his greatest chance of survival was to withstand these attacks. The repeated Muslim charges smashed bloodily against the Franks, with al-Rahman ordering probing assaults at particular points of perceived weakness. Yet despite these repeated charges and perhaps some initial fragmentation of parts of the Frankish line, Charles's Franks held firm. However, the same could not be said for the Umayyad invaders. Sometime during the early afternoon, Odo, likely leading a small contingent of cavalry, rode around the main melee in a wide flanking attack on the Muslim camp. Odo's attack managed to penetrate the Muslim camp, slaughtering many non-combatants, and yet he was not able to completely overrun it. As aforementioned, it's almost certain that the camp offered serious resistance, the Umayyad rearguard probably preventing a total slaughter, though the overall damage had already been done in another way. Back at the main clash, word spread through the Umayyad ranks that the camp itself was being attacked and perhaps having little choice. Al-Rahman ordered a general withdrawal to check Odo's assault there. Seizing the moment, Charles launched his own full-scale counterattack, reaching the Muslim camp and engaging Al-Rahman and his men once more. At this stage, the second breakthrough of the battle came with the fall of the Umayyad commander himself. This, however, did not precipitate a disorderly collapse or rout, as even so the Muslim warriors did manage to push back the Franks. Indeed, it was Charles who ordered a general withdrawal back to his own camp as the evening darkened, though he left the Muslim host battered and now leaderless. As morning dawned, the Frankish leader once more determinedly arrayed his warriors for battle. But this time, no fighting ensued. The Umayyad army had taken the opportunity to withdraw in good order during the night, having left their camp intact, as well as their prisoners and a hefty stash of loot. The loot alone was sufficient to stymie any serious pursuit of the invaders, as well as a general lack of cavalry. Charles himself withdrew north via Orleans, content to allow Odo to clean up the smaller Muslim groups that remained. The Battle of Tours thus concluded not so much on the tail end of an annihilation, but in a checking of the main Muslim advance. Charles had prevented Al-Rahman's host from reaching the Abbey of St. Martin's and scored an unambiguous and famous victory over the Umayyad Caliphate. However, the Muslim presence in Francia was hardly eradicated. The Umayyads would remain a continuing presence in the region well past the lifetime of Charles, with Charles's son, Pepin, finally driving them out of Narbonne some years later. However, though contained to Al-Andalus, the long Reconquista south of Charles's domain would endure for centuries to come.